From sea to shining sea, a term we know well today, defining the borders of our great country. But that wasn't always the case. The expansion of America started nearly as soon as the Revolution ended. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase nearly doubled the size of the country. The annexation of Texas and the cession of Mexico joined our two coasts. The first wagon train to cross the continent and head to California left from Missouri on May 1st, 1841. Around only 100 white settlers lived in California at this time. It was Mexican territory after all, sparsely populated. It took the wagon train 6 months to reach California. They all suffered greatly, having to abandon wagons due to lack of food and water, rough terrain. A second wagon train left in 1842, nearly 100 settlers bound for Oregon. By 1846, the trip west had been made by thousands of settlers. Well-laid trails had been set up. Independence, Missouri was a popular starting point. Nearly 500 wagons left Independence in 1846. The Donner brothers, George Donner, 60, and Jacob, 56, had already migrated from North Carolina to Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, Texas, and finally ended up in Springfield, Missouri. They were considered elderly farmers. Word had reached Springfield, Missouri of the prosperous West by letters and books sent back east, urging settlers to make their way to the Pacific coast. One of these books, Travels Among the Rocky Mountains Through Oregon and California, by Lansford Hastings, filled the two brothers' minds with possibilities. The winter of 1845, the Donners and the Reeds of Springfield started preparations of the journey to California. The book, The Expedition of the Donner Party and Its Tragic Fate, written by Eliza Donner, in 1911, talk about the preparation. Father stored in his wagon a quantity that was deemed more than sufficient to last until we should reach California. Seeds and implements for use on prospective farms. There were bolts of cheap cotton, red and yellow flannel, bright bordered handkerchief, glass beads, necklaces, chains, brass finger rings, earrings, looking glasses, and other knickknacks intended for distribution as peace offerings to the Indians. There were rich stores of laces, muslins, silks, satins, and velvets, destined to be exchanged for Mexican land grants. Materials of women handiwork, watercolors, oil paint, books, and school supplies, a liberal sum of money for incidental expenses and supplies, 2 wide buckskins to be worn for concealment, a sum of $10,000 cash was stitched into the folds of a quilt. The Donner and Reeds left Springfield, Missouri on April 14, 1846. With a dozen teamsters and employees, they reached Independence, Missouri within a month. May 12th, they had joined the main wagon train on the way to Fort Laramie. Timing was crucial for immigrants headed west. They had to beat the snow in the mountains before the snowpack was too deep to cross. The Donners and Reeds resupplied in Independence and set off again on May 12th during a large thunderstorm. After a week, they joined a group that was camped on Indian Creek, led by Colonel William Russell. They had traveled 100 miles west. They were delayed 13 days later by the Big Blue River, its waters being too high to cross. This is where the first death hit the company. Not uncommon for wagon trains. It was actually pretty rare not to have somebody die on the journey out west. 70-year-old Sarah Keyes was on her way to see her son one last time. After getting the news, she only had a few months to live. She had been diagnosed with consumption known as tuberculosis today. It was the leading cause of death during the time, an infection in the lungs. The travelers built ferries to cross the river. They followed the Platte River over the next month, having few problems arise. They reached Fort Laramie on June 27, 1846. James Reed saw an old friend at Fort Laramie, who had just traveled a new route with Lansford Hastings, the same Hastings whose book reached Springfield, Missouri the previous winter, and ignited the desire to move out west. His friend, James Clayman, told Reed not to take the Hastings route, that it was impossible with wagons, barely passable on foot. He warned of the great desert, and steep Sierra Nevadas. The pioneers were joined by other wagons at Fort Laramie. On July 12th, a man carrying a letter from Hastings arrived. The letter stated that Hastings would meet immigrants at Fort Bridger and lead them on through his cutoff, that they would pass south of the Great Salt Lake instead of detouring northwest towards Fort Hall. The letter stayed off any fears of the new route. July 19th, the wagons arrived at the Little Sandy River, where the trail split off into two trails, the northern established trail and the new southerly untested Hastings Cutoff. The majority of the group stayed on the main route. The group that remained had to elect a new leader. They chose George Donner over Reed. Party consisted of the Donners, George Donner 60, his wife Tamsin 45, their three children, Francis 6, Georgia 4, Eliza 3. George's children from a previous marriage, Alitha 14, Leanne 12, Jacob Donner 56, his wife Elizabeth 45. Their children, George 9, Mary 7, Isaac 5, Samuel 4, Louis 3, Solomon 14, William 12. Each Donner brother had 3 wagons, 2 teamsters, Noah 20, Samuel 25, and their friend John 28. The Reed family, made up of James Reed 46, his wife Margaret 32, their children Martha 8, James Jr. 5, Thomas 3, Virginia 13, their servant Eliza 25, Bayless 24, and the teamsters Milford 28, Walter 25, and James 25. The Breen family consisted of Patrick Breen 51, his wife Peggy 40, their children John 14, Edward 13, Patrick Jr. 11, Simon 9, Peter 7, James 5, and Isabel 1. Eddy family, William Eddy 28, his wife Eleanor 25, their children James 3 and Margaret 5. They only had 1 wagon. The Murphy family, widow Lavinia Murphy 50, her kids Landrum 15, Mary 13, Lemuel 12, William 11, Simon 10, her daughter Sarah 23 and her husband William 28 and their son George 4, her daughter Harriet 21 and her husband William 25, with their children Naomi 3 and Catherine 1. They had 2 wagons. A group of 5, the Wolffingers, Spitzers, and Reinhardts. William McCutton, 30, and his wife Amanda, 30, and their 1-year-old daughter Harriet. The Grays family, Franklin, 57, his wife Elizabeth, 47, her kids Sarah, 22, and her husband Jay, 23, Mary, 20, William, 18, Eleanor, 15, Louina, 13, Nancy, 9, Jonathan, 7, Franklin Jr., 5, Elizabeth, 1. They had 3 wagons and 1 teamster, John, age 25. There was Charles Stanton, 35, Luke Holleran, 25, and Antonio Shepard, 23. The group led by George Donner arrived at Fort Bridger July 28th. Unfortunately, Hastings had already left with another group. He left a note saying other travelers should follow and catch up. The group rested their oxen and themselves, repaired the wagons, and prepared for what was supposed to be a 7-week journey. The party left July 31st. There were 74 people in 20 wagons. At first, they made good time, nearly 10 to 12 miles a day. They passed through Echo Canyon and made it to the Weber River August 6th. They found a note Hastings had left, advising them not to follow down the Weber Canyon, but to try the Salt Basin. The canyon was nearly impossible. James Reed and 2 men rode ahead to catch up with Hastings. They found them at the Great Salt Lake. Hastings and Reed rode part of the way back with a little convincing, so Hastings could point out a route that he thought would save them a week of travel. Another family caught up with the wagon train while the others were camped near Weber Canyon. The number was now 87 pioneers and 23 covered wagons. The party had to decide to backtrack to Fort Bridger or to forge a new route that Hastings recommended. They decided to forge ahead a new trail. August 11th, they began the atrocious journey, clearing trees and other obstacles, forging a new trail through the Wasatch Mountains. Progress was slow. They were lucky to make 2 miles a day. After 6, they had only made it 8 miles. The pioneers began to curse and blame Hastings. When they finally reached the Salt Lake, they blamed James Reed as well. August 25th, the second death during their journey. Luke Halloran died of consumption. Food and water were running low. They were behind schedule after the difficult trek through the mountains. 21 days since they departed, they made it 36 miles. August 30th, they set off through the Great Salt Desert. After letting their oxen rest, Hastings said the journey would take 2 days. What they found was deep, sticky sand, moistened in the hot sun. The wagons sunk down to the hubs, making for slow progress. After 3 days, their water was nearly all gone. Some of Reed's oxen ran off deep into the desert, crazed from thirst. On September 4th, they made it out of the desert, over twice as long as Hastings said it would take. Reed left 2 of his wagons. The Donners and Kesselberg both abandoned 1 each. The group went over their supplies and found it less than adequate for the remainder 600-mile trek. Snow powdered the mountain tops that night. On September 26th, they made it to the Humboldt River. The group sent 2 men, William McCutcheon and Charles Stanton, ahead to bring back supplies from Sutter's Fort. The group traveled again, finally making it to the original path of Hastings. They had traveled an extra 125 miles, cursing Hastings every step of the way. They traveled along the Humboldt River for 2 weeks. And on October 5th, 2 wagons got entangled. A teamster, John Snyder, began to beat his oxen. James Reed, horrified of his treatment to the animal, ordered him to stop. John Snyder struck James Reed with the whip handle, and when his wife stepped in, he struck her as well. James Reed, enraged, grabbed his knife and killed the teamster with a shot to the gut. American laws did not apply on the trails, and justice was given out swiftly. Some wanted to hang James Reed, but it was decided to banish him without a rifle. The next day, his stepdaughter, Virginia, rode away ahead, secretly giving Reed a rifle and supplies for the trail. Tensions were high after this, every group not trusting the other. The animals were exhausted, and to spare them, each member had to walk. On October 7th, Louis Kesselberg turned out an old man named Hardcoop, who was traveling with him. He could not keep up on foot with the wagons. He asked the others for help, but no one would take him in. He was last seen sitting on a bank underneath a sagebrush, unable to walk with swollen feet. No one stopped to help. On October 12th, Paiute Indians attacked their oxen, killing 21. On October 16th, they reached the gateway to the Sierras on the Truckee River. Nearly out of food supplies, 3 days later, to everyone's surprise and elation, one of the men sent ahead to Sutter's Fort arrived with 7 mules, beef, flour, and 2 Indian guides. The other man stayed at the fort, having fallen ill. The pioneers camped for 5 days, resting the oxen a mere 50 miles from the summit. This delay would prove disastrous to the pioneers, not knowing just how close a time period was when the pass would become impassable. October 28th, James Reed arrived at Sutter's Fort and joined William McCutcheon. They began preparations to go back for their families. Meanwhile, the pioneers set off for the summit. The Donner's axle broke and they fell behind the other settlers. 22 people in all stayed behind. George Donner began cutting a new axle when the chisel he was using slipped and cut his hand badly. The rest of the party that had continued reached what is now Donner Lake. Just as snow began to fall, Stanton and the 2 Indian guides pressed ahead, reaching the summit, but were halted by the storm. They retraced their steps back over 5 feet of fresh snow that covered the tracks. With the pass just 12 miles away, the wagon train attempted to reach it, but retreated back to the lake, which had level ground. At the lake, there was an existing cabin from previous pioneers. 2 more were built. 59 people in all sheltered in 3 cabins, waiting for the snow to melt, enough to make it through the pass. The 22 people with the Donners were 6 miles back at Alder Creek. They built 3 shelters from tents, quilts, buffalo robes, and brush. 2 attempts were made from Donner Lake to cross the summit, both ending in failure. The situation becoming desperate, more shelters were built, multiple families sharing each shelter. Meanwhile, Reed and McCutcheon headed back to reach the settlers. It began to rain as they pressed on forward. It finally turned to snow, and they were stopped 12 miles from the summit. They cached the supplies and returned to Sutter's Fort, thinking with all the oxen the settlers had plenty of food, not knowing of the Indian raids and the loss of the great amount of oxen. They tried to get volunteers, but the Mexican-American War had taken any able-bodied man. The rescue had to wait. On November 26th, it snowed again. November 29th, the last oxen was killed. November 30th, 5 feet of snow fell. Many of the mules and other animals wandered off or were buried in the snow. A few days later, the last of the cattle were slaughtered. Shortly after, they began to boil hides, twigs and bones, bark. Some tried to hunt with little success. December 15th, Bayless Williams died of malnutrition. The group knew something had to be done before they would all die. December 16th, 5 men, 9 women, and 1 child departed on snowshoes for the summit. This group would be known as the Forlorn Hope. They were hoping to travel the 100 miles to Sutter's Fort. Already extremely low on supplies, weak, malnourished, the group faced a harrowing ordeal. After the departure of the snowshoe party, the remaining settlers hunted mice in their cabins, boiled bones repeatedly, becoming more and more weak as the ordeal continued. 6 days after they left, the snowshoe party ran out of food. No one ate for 3 days as they were traveling through the fierce wind, abysmal cold, biting snow. Charles Stanton became snowblind and he fell behind. He never rejoined the group. A blizzard struck and they had trouble keeping a fire lit. Antonio, Patrick Dolan, Franklin Graves, and Lemuel Murphy soon died. The others resorted to cannibalism, living off of the bodies of those that had died along the way. The snowshoe party was numbered at 7 by the time they reached the safety on the west side of the mountain. January 19th, 1847, only 2 of the men had survived, but all 5 of the women had survived their hardship. 7 out of the 8 bodies were cannibalized. Messengers were sent out to all the nearby settlements. Money was raised and relief parties were sent out with supplies. February 5th, the first relief party set off. February 7th, a second relief party led by James Reed left with supplies. February 19th, 1847, the first party reached Donner Lake. At first, it appeared deserted, until a thin, frail, ghostly figure of a woman appeared. 12 of the settlers were dead at camp, but by no means was the ordeal over. Some had gone crazy, and others barely clinging to life. No pack animals could be brought up through the deep snow, so few amounts of food could be brought with the rescue party. The relief party gave the starving settlers a little bit of food at a time, fearing that if they ate too much, they would die. The first party left with 23 survivors. 2 died on the return journey to Sutter's Fort. The 2 relief parties met going in opposite directions, and the Reed family had finally been reunited. March 1st, the second party arrived, finding horrible evidence of cannibalism. March 2nd, they reached Alder Creek, the Donner camp. They had also resorted to cannibalism. 17 survivors set off, but 2 days later, a blizzard struck. Isaac Donner died, and the others were too weak. Hiram Miller took 3 survivors, and the rest stayed at what would be known as Starved Camp. March 12th, the third relief party arrived. Miss Graves and her son Franklin were dead. The 3 bodies, including Isaac Donner, had all been cannibalized. March 13th, they arrived at the lake. Both of their sons had died. March 14th, arriving at Alder Creek, George Donner was unable to travel, dying from a severe infection in his wound caused from the chisel. His wife, though in good health, refused to leave her husband. She sent her 3 girls with the rescuers. A 4th relief party set off over a month later. They arrived on April 17th after getting stuck in a snowstorm. When they arrived, the only survivor was Louis Kesselberg, found with a pot of human remains, a pistol belonging to the Donners, and a stash of gold and jewelry. The rescuers threatened to hang Kesselberg right then and there. He told the men Tamsin Donner asked him to cash the money so one day it might benefit her children. The party returned with Kesselberg, having narrowly evaded hanging. After the harrowing ordeal in the mountains, 2/3 of the men had died, but 2/3 of the women and children had survived. 41 people had died altogether, and 46 survived. 5 died before reaching the mountain, 35 died at the camp or trying to cross the mountain, and 1 died after reaching the valley. Many lost toes to frostbite, and nearly all of them succumbing to cannibalism. News spread of the Donner Party across America. The Hastings Cutoff was abandoned. Immigration to California fell off drastically in 1847, but in 1848, gold was found in California, leading to one of the largest migrations in American history. There are many things I left out of this video. There's a lot of detail about the hardships suffered while the snowshoe party was out looking for salvation. Details of cannibalism, too graphic for YouTube. But if you want to read more into the details, there is many books and documentaries to read or watch, as well as first-hand journals of the horrible acts that took place, as well as murder on the mountain. In depth with all the extreme atrocities that happened. It was a horrible event. They're lucky that half of them even survived. I think the main reason the kids survived, mainly the kids and the women survived, is because the parents were basically, there was a lot, I went through the list of all the ages on their children. A lot of those kids were all the way down to 1-year-olds, most of them toddlers, and a lot of teenagers. So the kids were given extra food from their parents. You know, a parent wants their children to survive. And of course, the father wants his wife to survive and his family to survive. So they'll do anything to get their family to survive. And I think that's the main reason the women and children survived extremely more over the men. But it was a horrible moment in history, devastation, but it did not stop expansionism to the west. The Great Migration, an extreme amount of people continued to head west in covered wagons. Even more and more routes were set up. The west boomed. It boomed big time. And again, to end this off, yes, coast to coast, sea to shining sea. That's our country in a nutshell. And that's just a small little portion of what happened on one group of settlers' journey out west. Hope you enjoyed this one. Please like, comment, subscribe. Comments, criticisms, anything you got, put it down below. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you on the next. Peace.